Hello, welcome. I wanted to go over a little bit of terminology as we get started. I'm just going to kind of run through. If you go into, I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully this works. Okay. So if you go into the course, there's a terminology list. I'm still making this stuff. And if you click there, there's a list of words, and you can type those. So I'm just going to go through these words. These are words that are common in journalism, and just sort of things that, you know, as long as we share some of these terms, there might be some more I could add, but these are kind of common ones that there's a lot of words, a lot of terminology that gets thrown about, and it just makes it easier for everybody to understand it. So as far as it goes, let me find it here. So we're talking about a lot of things that have to do with the newspaper. We could also, these also apply to other things, but we'll start off with sort of these newspaper terms. And one of the first ones is just nameplate or masthead. And basically that's this thing here at the top of any newspaper page that has the name of the publication. They call that the nameplate or the masthead. And sometimes they also call it a flag. Next thing is a mugshot. Now, most of you know what a mugshot is. A mugshot is just a picture of a person, usually like that's committed a crime. But in journalism, oftentimes, you know, when you do a story, they'll put a mug or mugshot inside of a story. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they committed a crime. Let's see if there is one in this issue. This is the paper for today when I'm working on this. And of course, as would be, there does not appear to be any, but let's just see. Let's go back a few days and see. What it usually is it's just a small inset of a picture of a person. This is sort of a mugshot, but it's a bit big. It's just anytime you have a picture of a person, that's probably right there. That's a good mugshot right there. So if you click on that, this right here, we call it a mug or a mugshot. And so it's just something, you know, like, yeah, we could just use a mug is a term you might need thrown about. This one's probably one you're fairly familiar with. I mean, the word headline, you know what a headline is. They also call it a head for slang. So usually it's spelled H-E-D, and that's just a head or headline. Now, one thing to note is you're in a news writing class, and so you might be saying, okay, you know, I have to write headlines. Well, you know, a lot of times people want to write their own headlines. It is actually the case that editors usually write headlines and writers write the stories. And that's just because of the fact that, you know, depending on where on a page you put a story or depending on how you want to play it online, you know, this headline, socially distant band camp, is going to be different than, say, a headline down here versus a headline over here. They all have to have different numbers of words and different numbers of spaces. Now, the next word is a subhead, as you would think. It's a subhead. And that's this right here. It's the official 53 positive cases of COVID-19 in the county. That would be a subhead. It's a headline that is subordinate to the main headlines. They call that a subhead. There's not really much to it. Usually you try to get new information into a subhead that wasn't in the original headline. And it's just a way to further draw readers into a story. Those are usually pretty, I wouldn't say they're horribly common, but I would say that most stronger publications try to include them online as well as in print, because oftentimes people read the first thing and they go, I don't know, and they don't read it. And so a subhead helps kind of give further information and draws people into it. All right, the next two words are package and centerpiece. These are both what we would call design elements. A package is basically just the whole entire thing for the news story. So for example, this one here has a photo and a story and another photo. And so it's kind of the package is sort of what we would call the main story and art. Like most pages that are full pages have a art element. And so for example, this is the front page of Saturday, August 15th paper, State Journal Register. It has a package there. This here is a package, although it's standalone art. It's a standalone photo of just people at a band camp. And so these are what we would call the package. Now we also have the word centerpiece, and centerpiece is the idea of if you have a package that's sort of the main focus of a page, we call that a centerpiece. So those are both kind of just terminology, and where this would be of importance in a news writing class is that, you know, we say, well, we may want to think about making that a package, or that could be a good centerpiece, is saying, hey, that's not only a good story, but it's a story that has good art and would make it a good, you know, like thing to dominate. Even online websites have centerpieces and packages. You know, if you go to most websites, news websites, there's usually a photo towards the top with a headline. That would be the package, that would be the centerpiece, that would be the thing that dominates the design. And so being a package or centerpiece means it has art, is art friendly, and that type of thing. We could go ahead and jump down the list. I think it's on the second page to the word art. I'm using that word here. Art is basically anything that is a photo. A photo, it could be a graph, it could be anything that's visual is considered art, but most commonly we just refer to photos as art. Usually in journalism they don't say, hey, we need a photo. Usually they say, hey, we need art for this, is a way of just saying we need something visual to draw you in. So art is just another term for a photo. All right, let's see, lead story. Now, one thing you might note when you read a paper is all the headlines. Like this headline is clearly a lot bigger than the headline over here at the side. Actually, it's even bigger than this one down here. And so every news page has what we call hierarchy, that there's a story on every page that's supposedly the most important. It's kind of the lead story of the page, the lead story of the newspaper, etc. Traditionally, you would put your lead story over here, or you'd put it across the top. But in this case, because this has the largest headline, this is technically the lead. This is the one that your eyes go to first. And so people, you know, a lead story on any page is important. And so we call that the lead story. And so in a broadcast, the lead story would be the first story you talk about when the broadcast begins. And in a newspaper, it's the first big story on the first page. It's the thing people see first. And so a lead, you know, it has to do with news judgment, which we're going to talk about here fairly quickly, is about what do we think people actually are going to want to read and what's going to get them to buy a publication. Now, what you'll find is even inside, like here, this headline is really dark. It's got what we call, and I won't make this terminology here. This has what we have is a script that's considered sans serifs, and this one's a serifed, kind of a thin words. You see how the letters aren't nearly as bold as up here. They also have these little tails on them that these up here don't really have. There's no real tails. The end doesn't have a little tail at the end. Like here, there's a little line at the bottom on distant or band, but in the word Sangamon, there's no like little tail on it. Those are called serifs. And this is sans serif, it's bolder, and that kind of is usually used for more hard news and to stand out, because the idea is serifs make it harder to read from a distance. And so things you want to stand out and jump out, you use a sans serif headline text. Now, that's a lot of information you may not want, but the other side of the coin is serifed text is usually easier to read when you're reading it small on a page. So that's why you usually use Times New Roman versus Arial, or use Courier New instead of Arial or something like that, is because those are a little bit easier to read. So this is a sans serif. It's very bold. It's very big. It's at the top of the page. That's clearly the lead story. And you'll find that throughout, whatever they put at the top, this biggest headline, top of the page, is the lead story. Top of the page, biggest headline, maybe that one might be a little bit bigger, but because it's at the top, we would kind of consider that the lead story. And so what happens is every page, every newspaper, every broadcast, every section of a website has usually what we call a lead, and that's very important in determining news value and news judgment. Let's see, where were we? Modular. Modular, if you look at a newspaper, what you'll find is you'll find that this wasn't always the case, but if you were to take and cut out this, it would make a perfect rectangle. If you were to cut out this story, it would make a perfect rectangle. If you were to cut out this story, it would make a perfect rectangle. And so once again, this jump, perfect rectangle. The today in history, perfect rectangle. Photo and headline, perfect rectangle. The idea is we don't take this story and bump it up into here and then have that story kind of going down on that last column. We keep everything in perfect rectangles. And so you can move these about. You could take this and move it below that one really quickly. You could take this side story about PetSmart and move it over here very quickly. You could move this story at the top and move it to the bottom of the page very quickly. You could rearrange it very quickly because everything is modular. It's in modules. And so that's kind of the key to newspaper design. And so I only bring this up because it's something I want you to kind of pay attention to when you look at anything in print, is we try to keep things in sort of perfect rectangles. And the idea is that it keeps readers kind of focused in that area. Now, what we also use is the word leg. Leg is every time you have one of these columns of text, we call that a leg of text. Now, that's really nothing more than, you say, well, we might say we need to fill out a leg, or, it's about one leg too long, or something. That would be kind of just newspaper slang for one of the little columns beneath the story. Now, we have this term dogleg. Dogleg is a violation of modularity, but sometimes when you have an ad stack like here, you might have a story that goes around an ad. Let me just see if we have any that do this. Might not get lucky on that. So let's just check another issue of the paper real quick. I'll just check a couple pages. No. Here we go. So you'll see this, all these legs are coming down, but this one kind of goes around the ad. That's called a dog leg. So it breaks the rules of modularity there, because if you were to cut this story out, you'd have all these kind of the legs up a little bit, which is why they call it a dog leg, dog lifting its leg. Okay. And so the case there is we have these, that's called a dog leg. I just giving you the term. I don't know that we'll use it that much in this class, but at least you're familiar with it for the purposes of just if, you get that thrown about. All right, byline, dateline, and body text. So here we go. This right here is a byline. It says who it's by. That's very easy. It has the word by at the front. Anytime you have the name of the person, their title, their organization, that's all part of the byline. Most newspapers put a byline on their stories. A dateline is this thing right here. Sometimes in certain things like the New York Times, they actually will put the date of publication or the date of writing of the story, but most just put where it was from. They call it a dateline, and it just says, New York, which means this story happened in New York or was reported from New York. There's a little bit of a debate, I suppose, that, technically the dateline is supposed to be where the reporter is reporting the news from. And then, but in some cases the reporter may do it remotely and they'll put New York on it because they were reporting on it from perhaps New Jersey or something, but it happened there. So that's usually just where the event happened. And it's usually all caps and it's the name. And you'll find that, on every story for the most part. Orlando, Florida, Chicago, those are jumps. Sometimes local stories won't do it. But you'll see here, Bedminster, New Jersey, and that gives you an idea where it is. And it quickly allows people to know where the story is coming from. And a dateline is sort of one of those things that's just, it's a standard journalism thing where people quickly know where the story is happening. Body text. Body text is real simple. This is a subhead, this is a head, this is a byline, that's a dateline, this is a jump line down here. All the rest of this here in the middle where the words of the story are, that's all considered body text. It's the text that makes up the body of the story. So it's just mainly basically the story itself. All right, now this is one that is kind of important. This one I'll use a lot is graph, G-R-A-F. Graph is slang for paragraph. And there's really nothing more to it. It's just it means paragraph. It's slang for paragraph. And a graph is just anytime you have an indented paragraph. And so we just use the word graph. So if I say to somebody like, I think it's in the 4th graph, then somebody goes down and goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there it is right there. That's the 4th graph. And so it's easier. Maybe we just need to move this graph higher or move this graph out or delete that graph. That's all just saying paragraph. It's slang for that, something you should be familiar with. I will use that regularly. Jump line. A jump line is when a story doesn't have room to stay on a page, they give it a jump line. It's this thing that says see school page 6 or see US Postal Service page 6. And then if you follow it, you click on that, you come here to the story where it's at, and that's called the jump. But the jump line is basically just telling you we're jumping somewhere else. Column. Column is, I think we pretty much covered. It's the same thing as a leg. It's just the space that goes down the side. Now, there's also a concept of a column as in an opinion-based news story that has some sort of opinion aspect to it is also called a column. I don't know if there would be any columns in this. Well, I mean, like, for example, let me find it here. Like Dear Abby, or in this case, I forget what this is called, Dear Annie, or the doctor questions. These are columns. They're basically opinion-based stories. They're kind of from their own perspective. They usually put a column mug on them, and those are called columns. But a column for also is what we call just the legs of a story, which leads us into column inches. In traditional newsprint, now most of us are moving to digital, so column inches don't apply, but you'll still hear that term. A column inch is essentially, on a traditional story like this page has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. That's the standard column count for this newspaper. The newspaper is probably about 20 inches from top to bottom. So from down here to up here is about 20, maybe 21 inches. So if you multiply 20 times 6, that's 120 inches. It means they have 120 inches of space, of column inches. So every column is by 1 inch is considered a column inch. So you have 6 columns by 20 inches, you have 120 column inches. Now that is important for the selling of ads. That's important for spacing things. And so typically at any organization, you know, if you're doing broadcasting, you have to budget out the minutes you have for the broadcast. So you would say, okay, we got a 17-minute broadcast night. I got 2 minutes for this story, 1 minute for that, 30 seconds for this, 15 for that, 4 for that, you know, and then you have to add up and you go, oh, well, we've got 18 minutes worth of stuff, but we only have 17 minutes worth of airtime. The same thing exists in print. If you have a magazine or a newspaper or anything else, you only have so much space. And so column inches are how we measure that space. We know we need, you know, 80 inches for a package because we have a photo. We're going to run over 4 columns, 5 inches deep. That's 20 column inches. And we're going to need a cut line or a caption below it. And we're going to need a headline. And we're going to need, you know, 20 inches of text in all the columns. And so column inch is how we measure stories, photos, everything on the page. And that happens with print as well as even like in news, in radio and broadcast, they use minutes or time. The print uses column inches. Now that also applies sometimes to online, where they'll say, you know, they'll still say like, I want a 7-inch story, or just make it, you know, 10 inches. But of course, now that we've moved more to an online digital world, the column inch is beginning to go away because you're not constricted in space as much, because you don't really, there's really no limit on how many, you know, I mean, you don't run out of page, you know, if you're on website, you know, the page essentially goes on forever. There's no real limit on space in that case. All right, bastard measure. This is kind of a weird, this is just a design element. I don't even know if why I put it in there to a certain degree, but the idea there is if you look, I don't know, let's see if we can find one that's really good on this. You see how everything's like, if this is 5 columns and these are 6 columns, you know, they're all sort of, every page has its own design. Well, sometimes on a page, they won't follow that template. And so in this paper, they actually seem to be following it fairly specifically. But if you look here, this column is clearly wider than this one. And this one's 5 columns, but this is 4, but then this last 5th column is really narrow. And so this is called a bastard measure. It's just basically where the column doesn't really, adhere to the template. The template that's built beforehand has everything in 6 columns, but in this case they decided, well, 6 columns across here is a little bit, just sort of, these are narrow columns for such a short distance from top to bottom. So they take it and they made it 5. So the text is a little bit wider. And that's called a bastard measure. Cut line. A cut line is just another word for caption. Every photo has or should have a cut line, and it should have a photo credit or a cut credit. And a cut line is just another word for caption. So nothing really there other than somebody might say, hey, they took a photo. Could you write a cut line for that? That means caption. Art we talked about. Agate. So agate's usually predominantly just used in sports. And so if we find a sports page here, this down here, this stuff down here where they give you box scores, this is called agate. It's usually in a very, very, very small text. I can't even read it, even if you have your screen really big. It gives all the scores. It says how many people hit balls, things like that. How many runs, how many errors. All of that is called agate. It's in very small text, and it's kind of classic, stocks are usually agate, and it's just really small information. And so if somebody's saying like, we can run that as agate, or, that seems more like agate than good storyline. That's really just saying it's information that's important. People want it. They want to look at the stats, but it's not something that stats and metrics, the standings in baseball, who's where and how many hits they made and how many runs were scored, how many errors, all that stuff people want to know, but it's not necessarily good information for a story. So there's a difference between agate information and story information. Entry point. An entry point is basically how you get into a story. Now, if you come back here and you see this, a headline is an entry point. A subhead is an entry point. A photo is an entry point. When you look at a page, oftentimes you look at the photo first, then you read the headline, then you read the subhead. And so anything that gets you to read the story that kind of catches your eye is considered an entry point into the story. These are all things that sell it. So as a writer, one thing you should think about is, how am I going to get people to actually want to read what I wrote? And the thing is you need entry points. You need things that make them want to read it. Good art will get people to want to read it. By social media that if you don't put a photo with something, then people probably aren't going to look at your post, right? You need photos. You need art to go with it. And you need a good catchphrase. You need information, that kind of catches attention. And those are what we call entry points. And so everything, the idea there is you need to think beyond just, I write the story, but, can I get art as an entry point? Can I get a graph as our entry point? Can I get something else? And so those are all entry points. This mugshot becomes an entry point, maybe like catches somebody's eye, things like that. We have the word call tag. Call tag is just COL tag. It's just the name of the writer. They put it at the end. It comes from column tag because I told you columns like Dear Abby is a column, and usually at the end of anything that's a column, they always give the name of the writer and why they're given that space, and they always give contact information. Most stories have column tags, and so one thing I want you to do is to think when you write a story, you should write a call tag. Say Tim McKenzie can be contacted at blah, blah, blah. All right, Slug. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, when you're writing stories, this story here didn't have a headline on it, like new COVID-19 cases in state top 1,500. And sweet delivery, that's just a photo. Local behavioral expert stigma surrounds virus. So all these stories are there, and they have headlines. They don't have headlines till they get to that point. But if you're in a newsroom, and this goes for print, broadcast, online, you need to have some sort of shorthand for what the story is about. And so what happens is they give it what's called a slug. A slug is basically the name you give the file on Word or in, on your, when you save your file, like story for class or English paper, you might call it, if you're doing a paper about death penalty, you put death penalty paper. And that's a slug. That's all a slug is. And so what happens is in a newsroom, I don't know, I don't think I have the word budget on here. So add the word budget to the terminology list. I'll actually add it before I put it back out there for you. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you, even though it's not on my list as I'm showing you here, but a budget is basically every newsroom has to budget the column inches, has to budget the time for a story, right? And so they put together a master document called a budget every day or every time they publish. And the budget lists all the stories. And so, and then they have what they call a budget meeting. And the budget meeting is where they talk about how much space they're going to give to each story, how many minutes, and they argue as you would over a budget for a business. You say, well, we only have 17 minutes, we only have 100 inches. What's the most important story? How much space does it need, etc. You know, it's just as one in a family might argue over, well, we have $100 to spend. What do we want to do? We can't afford that. We really need new tires. We really need this. You know, just as you would argue, newsrooms do that every single day. They have an afternoon and usually a morning budget meeting, depending upon the size and depending upon who gets invited. You know, those are what they do those, and those have, you know, changed a little bit over the years. But the case is you wouldn't have the whole story. You would just have slugs, and so everybody who has a story enters in the name of their story with a slug. It's just the slang. And so, for example, like this, local behavior experts, stigma surrounds virus. The slug in this case would have been the slang term for what the story is. And so they would have, like, this would probably be stigma story. And ball Chatham board, moles remote learning. You know, this might be Chatham board, might be the slug. And COVID state, you know, would probably be the slug for that. Coalition pushes universal broadband access. That might be broadband. And so somebody say, what do you think we should do? Do you want to lead with broadband or Chatham, Chatham board? Or do you want to lead with the state COVID numbers? Or do you want to lead with the COVID stigma story? And those would all be slugs. And so you wouldn't have to be like, I'd like to lead with local behavioral expert stigma surrounds virus. You know, you don't have to give a title. You don't even know what the title or the headline is yet. You just use that slug as your terminology, as your thing to toss around. Lead, usually spelled in the book, they spell it L-E-A-D. In most people, a lot of journalists spell it L-E-D-E, so I do it that way. The lead is the first, usually the first paragraph of any story that grabs your attention. Every news story needs, sometimes they'll be longer depending on the style of lead you use. Sometimes we use what are called anecdotal leads. There'll be 3 or 4 paragraphs, but a lot of times they're just 1 or 2 paragraphs. Most time they're just 1. And the idea there is it's sort of that first catch-all, gets you that who, what, when, where, you know, at least one aspect of that fairly quickly, and tells you why you want to read it. And so it's the lead information in the story. So we have a lead story, but every story has a lead. Leads are very important because they get that information out there. Journalists are trying to write to convey information, and so you are trying to get that information. The average, you know, newspaper has somewhere in the ballpark, like even like the State Journal Register has, I think it's like 20 to 30,000 words in a typical edition of the paper. 20 to 30,000 words, if you were to, you know, if you were to translate that into like a novel, that would mean about every 2 days is publishing a novel. Now, most of us don't read a novel or half a novel every day. And as a matter of fact, like the New York Times, their Sunday paper has somewhere in the ballpark of around 70,000 words or to 100,000 words, which is more than a novel. And so if you were to sit down and read the New York Times cover to cover, that's 100,000 words. So the case is you flip through and you maybe read a paragraph or 2. Most people don't read the whole story. And so most time we try to get as much information into the lead to grab the attention and get people to read the rest of the story, but also to give them the information quickly. And so the lead is that first paragraph, the first set of paragraphs that tell you what that story is about. Which brings us to the word nut graph. Now, in some cases, news stories will use a little bit more of a kind of an anecdotal or some other format to get you to find interest in the story. Sometimes they'll start off and they'll tell you, little Billy was struggling alone without, you know, blah, 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 you know, and it would tell you a little story about little Billy and how he overcame his problem. And that's called an anecdotal lead. But the case is usually Billy is being done to draw your attention to some other issue. Billy, we talked about Billy. Billy's struggle was because he's an only child and he hadn't had contact with other children. And with COVID-19, he was facing loneliness as a result of that or something, right? And so it's about mental health of only children in the time of COVID-19 when people are self-isolating or social distancing. And so what would happen is after you kind of start with that little story, you need to get back to the lead. The lead is what's the story about. And so if it's a buried lead, we usually call it a nut graph. The nut graph is what is this story about? And so you might say, Billy struggled, he didn't understand, he was lonely, he was acting out. And then finally they said, Billy is not alone. Like 52,000 children or 5 million children in America who are only children. The stresses of COVID-19 may be even greater, was isolation leads them to not even have a sibling to play with or something like that, right? And that's what we would call a nut graph. It's that graph that graph is paragraph that gets to the core, the nut of what is going on there. All right, the last two are kind of just technical terms. I'm not really sure. I think I had these on a list for an editing class, so I'll just throw them out there for fun. Kerning and letting. Basically, the idea there is like when you're reading, you see words and they're kind of close together, and then, but the thing is sometimes like if you need a little bit, like if you're running out of space on a printed page, you can move the letters a little bit closer together and then bump another word up and get a little bit more on a line. Just like if you're doing a newscast and you're broadcasting, you can read a little bit faster. Kerning is just moving the letters closer together, like, right to left, so they're closer together. If you move them too close, sometimes it makes words hard to read. And if you move them farther apart, just to stretch things out, you do that on broadcasting. They stretch things out where they have that banter. Oh yeah, that was a really good hot dog I had yesterday. That kind of thing. Oh, the fair is something I miss. Something like that. That is stretching. Time-wise, kerning and is stretching words together and apart in order to get it to fit. We don't typically like to do it, but that is one thing that happens. And then letting is the space between the lines. That is, you move them closer, farther apart. That's called letting. All right, and last but not least is the number 30. While most journalists don't use that anymore, you'll still see it in press releases. A lot of journalists like to use it. 30 means it's the same thing as saying the end. What happens is traditionally, back in the day, in a newsroom, what would happen is you would write your story on a typewriter, right? You'd actually have an old manual typewriter and you'd sit there and you'd type it out. And what would happen is especially on deadline, when you had a very tight deadline for the paper, you would need to get, and this was before, this is 50 years ago, you would need to write, and then maybe the copy desk would need to start copy editing and getting the stuff back to the press room to start, because back in the day, they actually had to get every single letter. They had to actually manually take little itty bitty pieces of metal that had each letter and put them into a little tray, and then they would tighten some screws and they would hold it there, and they would make a plate of just little individual letters that were sort of tightened into space, and they would do it. And then at the end of the night, they'd undo it, spill them out, and they'd have to sort all those letters back out. And then the next night, they'd have to put them all back in. They had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people working in the back doing this, right? Especially big papers, they had to do it. Well, obviously, if you have a 300 words or a 1,000-word story that's coming in 10 minutes before they go to press, they don't have time to sort through 1,000 letters in just a matter of matter of 5 minutes. So what would happen is, as you were writing, you would write the first page, and when you got done, you would yell for a runner, and then somebody would grab the paper and they would run it over the copy desk, who would begin editing it, and then they would send it over to the news, to the press room, where they would begin, or pre-press, where they would begin to put all the letters together and actually put the story together. And they might send it back to you, and how exactly that flowed around was different. But you might have like page 1, page 2, page 3. Well, each page, you'd be writing a story, you don't have it all in one document, you have it on individual pages. So when you got to the end of your story, people would put -30-, and it meant the end. And so that was all that meant. And so sometimes, like, for example, with journalists, they'll put -30 dash. Sometimes when a journalist retires, they'll put -30 dash. Or if somebody dies that was a journalist, they'll put that. It's just sort of a way of saying the end. And so it's a fun way of saying that it was just sort of the standard way to end it. And so back in the day, you know, as you got 3-4 pages in, you know, if you got to the end, you wouldn't bother to say continued on the next page. You just pull it out and say runner, and they would run it off to the next person. So in this case, they would, you know, when you got to the last page, if they saw there was a -30 dash, they knew that was the last page. There wasn't another page coming. So that's the terminology. I'm sure there's some more, but that's the main terminology. And I don't think there's much else. So I will see you when you get to class.